Welcome to the Coach Doctor podcast, a podcast where we discuss aspects of sports coaching from grassroots to grandstands. I'm your host, James Barkell, and on this podcast, we hear from academics who research coaching. We talk to coaches on the front line from development levels through to professional coaches, and we discuss other elements of successful sporting programs with experts and practitioners from a range of sports science fields, motivational psychology, strength and conditioning, and many other elements required for successful performance. If you'd like to know more about what we do at the Coach Doctor, you can visit our website, thecoachdoctor.com.au, and learn more about our services, or follow me on Instagram at thecoachdr or Twitter at James_Barkell for more regular information. Before I start the episode, I just wanted to let all the coaches and athletes out there know about a special deal that we've got going with Elite Performance Journals. EPJ make both coaches' notepads ideal for developing session plans and for reviewing or reflecting on sessions. And for athletes looking for that extra edge, they also have an Elite Athlete Journal designed around specific needs of up-and-coming professional athletes. For any listeners of the Coach Doctor podcast, you can receive 20% off on any of their products by simply going to eliteperformancejournal.com, check out all of their products, and when you check out, use the code COACHDOCTOR, all one word and lowercase, for a special 20% discount. For schools and clubs, you can also get journals specific to your group's needs, with schools or clubs' logos, team values, and many other options to make it specific to you. Okay, now on to the episode. In this week's conversation, I talked to Greg Lee. Greg is a coach at the community level in Rugby Union, and he really wants to help community coaches develop by sharing his thoughts and opinions around coaching at this level of the game. Some of the issues community coaches have to deal with is player availability, player work commitments, finding volunteers to assist with running grassroots clubs, plus many others that we discuss on the podcast. Greg, welcome to the program. Are you happy to start off by giving us some background into who you are and what you're currently doing?
Yeah, thanks, James. And I really appreciate you inviting me onto your podcast. I just wanted to start by saying I think you're doing a marvellous job with the Coach Doctor podcast, and I've really enjoyed listening to all the guests that you've had, from current players to former players, the high-level coaches that you've got on. Really enjoyed the one with Daryl Gibson, right through to the academics who discuss the research behind their theories. I think what you're providing is a really great contrast for all your listeners out there. To get back to your question, so who am I? I guess I'd say I'm an aspiring part-time rugby coach, although during the season, anyone who knows me, and as you well know, they always ask whether I'm off to my second job. But my first job is a school teacher. My most recent coaching appointment was with a local community club, the Newport Breakers, up here on Sydney's Northern Beaches, where I also live.
Greg, we've had a lot of coaches from either the elite end of their sport or from the grassroots side or development side of sport, but I haven't had many discussions with coaches who are coaching adult seniors at a community level. There's often a perception that adult community sport is just an excuse for social interactions, and there's little emphasis on actual athlete development. What are your thoughts on comments like these?
Well, James, sometimes I think perception is reality. I believe that the social interaction is probably one of the main reasons why people participate at every level. But yes, it definitely is one of the draw cards of rugby at grassroots level. Some of the clubs, I guess, are very good at providing an overall rugby experience, and I think many of the community clubs do it better than a lot of the premiership clubs. When it comes down to athlete development, the layers of development will vary depending on the level that they're competing at, and I believe the club itself. So some of the larger clubs that compete in the top two divisions will definitely have more focus on athletic performance and improving their athletes, especially when they're playing in the higher grades, whereas some of the smaller clubs will care about the performance a little less, but it depends on resources that they have as well. So maybe they're more focused on the social aspects. So to be fair, some of the clubs, they boast the fact that they play hard and they party hard, and rugby is more the excuse to have a good time. I think that many of these larger clubs have the best of both worlds. So they have higher grades who still love to compete, and the lower grade teams sort of accommodate more of the social aspect.
And I guess social interaction's important as part of our general day-to-day life, isn't it?
Yeah, I think it is. I mean, it's the social aspect of it really is a major draw card. And I think a lot of the guys that are drawn to grassroots level, some of them have been there and done that, and it's more based on a time commitment or the lack of time. So time's probably a really big thing. You know, people have families, people get new jobs, more responsibility, and less time to actually train. So that's definitely one of the draw cards.
So what are club and player expectations like at the community level?
Is it okay if I talk about both sides of this? I think the expectations of clubs and players in my experience are really quite subjective. I guess when you look at it by definition, when we talk about expectations, it's something along the lines of a strong belief that something will happen or something will take place. So the key is whether or not those goals and objectives are realistic or more idealistic. So what transpires rides pretty heavily on that. As coaches, I think we always look to be as positive as we can, but sometimes your experience tells you that you're unlikely to win a premiership with the players that you've got. So while you may not say that directly to the players, the success criteria really needs to be, I guess, positioned a little differently. From personal experience, I've seen club boards with very, very high expectations, and some of them are pretty unrealistic. And I think what I've seen is some clubs really need to separate the commercial side to the rugby operational side and let the coaches get on with coaching without the win ratio always being the metric.
Greg, I want to go through some of the challenges, but also some of the advantages of coaching at the community level. But if we were to identify the top 3 challenges and the top 3 advantages, what would they be for you?
That's an interesting and good question. I think that when you consider, I think the complexity of the way things are set up, challenges from my perspective, it's probably pretty similar at all levels. Recruitment of players and coaches is probably the number one thing because volunteerism is down, and as you know, at community level, there's not big budgets to pay coaches, and I think that also lends itself to being commensurate to the skill level as well. I think resources, so the options available. As an example, this season, you look at our club, we've got 5 senior teams, we've got a women's team, we've got juniors from under 5s all the way up to 18s, and we've got 1 oval that we use. Now, some of the juniors do use separate ovals, but as soon as it rains, all those teams are impacted quite greatly. And I think probably the final challenge is getting the balance of the rugby program right. So the capabilities versus the skill gaps, and also versus the brand of rugby you want to play. If I look at the advantages of coaching at this level, the time commitment is obviously very, very different. I mean, if I compare it to Premiership rugby, I started this year in February, opposed to starting in October the previous year. We train 2 nights a week instead of 3 nights a week. Our sessions are 90 minutes a session opposed to 2 hours a session. So that obviously makes a massive difference. I think at community level, there's probably a larger scope for growth. And in particular, if you're an experienced coach coming down, there's a lot of players who haven't been exposed to some of the things that you can showcase. And the final thing would probably be the social interaction. I think really being part of a local community is really important. And I think whilst some of the premiership clubs would still boast being a large part of the community, I think the local grassroots clubs really do. I mean, a classic example of this in the work that I do, being a school teacher, I had an email from a parent of a student that I teach, and the email congratulated me on such a successful season first. And then, by the way, here's the presentation that my daughter's just done. So, I mean, I think that's quite a massive part.
So what are the differences at both ends of the spectrum from coaching at elite and then coaching at the community level?
Well, I think probably the most significant is the amount of detail across all aspects of the game and the amount of time it takes to get through that detail. the amount of pre-season testing that we've done is very different to what you do at premiership level. Although, we look at load management. We look at the complexity of attacking and defensive shapes and options. But when you compare that to, say, for example, premiership level, there's a lot more that you've got to get through. And it's a matter of, I think, the way that I look at it is when we periodise the season, we certainly don't have the time to go through the amount of detail. So I search for the big rocks and try and focus on the things that are going to make the most significant difference on field.
Yeah, so you coached at that semi-professional environment before at premiership level. How does managing the players in the community environment differ to that of the semi or the professional environment?
Look, I don't think there's a huge amount of difference, to be honest with you. I think there are a lot of similarities. I think most players want to be treated fairly, and many say that transparency and honesty is what they want to see. But as we both know, a lot still don't like the truth. You try and be as empathetic and objective with any feedback that you provide, but at community level, it's not always possible. So time is probably the single biggest factor that's against us. So again, unlike premiership level, we don't have reoccurring reviews and preview sessions that might happen on a Monday night, and this can really impact the progression of some of the players. As you coach, you sort of do what you can, and you review and preview yourself, and you're sort of giving it to the players in a condensed manner, I suppose. You can explain things to them in certain ways, but without that time to go through everything, sometimes it doesn't resonate.
So with your club in particular, the mighty Newport Breakers, there are a lot of players who work in trades and potentially do a lot of physical work during the day, like working on building sites or landscaping. Do coaches at that community level need to be aware of this and manage player loads at training in community sport?
Yeah, absolutely. Look, I don't think, again, it's that different, and I actually think it's missed quite a lot at community level, and at some premiership level clubs, I think it's also so missed as well. And I think it really comes down to knowing your players and what they do. I learnt my lesson at premiership level, but now I'm very conscious of it. And in fact, I'd go so far as to say that it probably impacts junior rugby as well. I mean, I've heard of some junior examples where, especially when the boys start getting to 14 and 15, and they're a little more body conscious and they start doing weights programs. Now, some get proper advice and they train themselves accordingly. Others overtrain and they really leave themselves susceptible to injury. And I've heard of cases where, this has occurred where boys have gone on and they're because they've been doing so much shoulder work and overloading themselves, they get onto the field and they sustain quite serious injuries. So, we at our club, as I mentioned before, we did some basic testing at the beginning of the season to get some markers, but then the rain threw a lot of that out. So again, we had to look at loading and try and work out how best to adjust that, because what we don't have is the kind of data we, at community level, or I'd say very few clubs would be using any kind of GPS data to, track the loads. But the other thing is getting to know those players, and a lot of it comes out in conversations that you might have. So, if a player came up to me and I, said, how was work today? And he said, oh, well, I've just been, digging an 8-metre trench. Obviously, I'll either adjust the whole session or I'll pull that player out mid-session when I think he's looking to, starting to show signs of fatigue, I guess.
When you get to training, how do you differentiate your session to meet the needs of both those players in that situation?
Well, quite often, as I mentioned, I'll try and have as many conversations as I can before training to get a bit of an idea about that. And I think the players got to know me now, and a lot of them will come up and have a chat to me about those type of things. But it's certainly, anecdotally, there's a correlation. I mean, I've seen some of my players work on a Saturday morning, and it definitely impacts the performance in their game, because they've been up at 5 or 6 o'clock doing a shift. My hooker's a plumber, and he often works before games. And although it's at 3 o'clock, you've still got fatigue, and it definitely comes out in his games because you can see the difference.
Yeah, okay. I'd imagine that a lot of those players at the elite level they're getting their full 8 hours sleep, if not a little bit more. They're, getting up, having their breakfast, and they're nice and relaxed during the day. They're spending a lot of time relaxing before they go and play, at 3 o'clock. So you've got a massive difference there between the two levels of athletes.
Yeah, but I guess to a certain degree, it's quite relative because there's probably a lot of clubs that are in similar situations. But it certainly, it certainly does show itself. And again, the tough thing at our level is we very rarely carry a bench of fresh reserves. So maybe the person that you're replacing them with has also worked in the morning and is extremely tired. So, we watch the previous grade quite closely to watch who's fatigued. If we can get a player off early, we'll always do it. But managing the load, I think, has helped us a lot with injuries this year.
Yeah, great. So you talked about having conversations with players before training. How important is it to know your athletes, and what things do you have to know?
Look, the more you know about the player, the more you can get through, and you can be more efficient with that throughout your sessions and throughout the season. Probably the best example is knowing how your players learn and how they process information. So having a teaching background, it sort of comes naturally, and their learning styles can really help that efficiency at training. So, whether they're visual learners, whether they're oral learners, they like seeing written information, or, they're kinesthetic learners. But generally, I use all of the above to get my messages across. And once I've sort of got an idea, then I might concentrate. So if I know that, one of my backs loves to see a schematic of the move, then we'll show that. I'll give him an explanation, and then we'll actually walk through it and we'll practice it. And look, by and large, most of the players like parts of all of the learning methods.
So one of the challenges around communication with players is the time. I mean, if you've got 15 starting players, and then you've got, these second graders who are, aspiring to play first grade, and and then you might have more players down below. Trying to take the time to communicate with all of those players can be time consuming. How do you fit that in as a coach?
Yeah, it's a pretty tough one, to be honest with you, especially if you're looking to rotate a player. We probably don't get the same opportunities as what we did at premiership level. You've got players who you might want to rotate player X this week, but he's late to training or he's got to work. So the last thing I really want to do is not have a face-to-face. But it seems as though the current generation with social media, sometimes you can have those conversations online. Yeah. Not my ideal scenario. A lot of the times, the young players don't pick up phone calls. So they'll respond to social media. Not ideal, but in today's world, that's what happens. So I think it's important to try and speak to them as much as you can. Some of them are really good, and we'll have a conversation after the session, especially if it's about progression or things that they can do. But I try and put a lot back onto them, because without having a formal review with all players present, I have to rely a lot on the players to do some of their work, and often I'll ask them to come back to me with some areas that they feel are a little more contentious, or areas that they want to improve, and then I can give specific information and guidance.
So when you're having those, if you have to have difficult discussions, if you've got to drop a player or something like that, would you try to make sure it's in person? Or, as you said, these days players might not pick up the phone. They've got other things going on in their lives. They might not get to training that week. Is it possible to have a difficult conversation over WhatsApp or something like that?
Look, not ideal. I have done it before, but in most cases, yeah, it'll be face to face. But I'm certainly not one of those coaches that one bad game and you're out. They would have been spoken to about what they need to improve. Very similarly, if the player in the grade below is really nipping at their heels, they'll be told that this player is really doing this really well, and that's what I'm looking for. So in a lot of cases, it comes as no surprise. And some players come up and say, "Yep, I'm probably going to be rotated down to second grade." So. Yep. But yeah, face-to-face is always better.
On that, how do you manage a player who would usually be a starting first grade player. Let's say they're the star player of the club. They've had an injury and they've been out for 4 or 5 weeks. They're now recovered and they're ready to come back. Do you move that player straight back into first grade? And what happens if the player that has replaced them over those 4 or 5 weeks is actually doing a good job? That scenario.
The conundrum of returning to play. Look, I think in an ideal world, I said it to the coaching group at the beginning, I would prefer to see players come through either the grade below. So we did have a little bit of a rule as to how long they were out for, what kind of injury it was, and it also depends on the position. So I guess as an example, if you had a front rower and, like a lot of clubs, very thin on front rower stock, that front rower might get half a game in the grade below on his first week back. And the following week, he might get half a game in first grade again. And then the following week, if he comes through that, he'll be back with his full load. Sometimes, if we've got a plethora of players, so like every other club, a lot of back rowers, the back rower might have to come through third grade, for example, and work his way up. And I think it's, it is one of those conversations where you need to speak to the player and say, well, we've promoted James into first grade. James is doing a sterling job because he's been given the opportunity. Now it's your job to displace him. So it really comes down to being pretty honest and transparent with the player. But you've also got to be fair and reasonable with the player, especially if they're doing a good job. If there is still a massive difference, and this guy who's replaced him, isn't quite up to it, well, the time may be a little bit quicker as to the rotation.
What happens if you got the grand final the next week?
Well, if
star player.
Well, if it's a star player, it depends on his injury. I've been burnt with things like this before, where people say, "Yeah, I'm right, coach, put me in," and I'm still a little bit hesitant. So you'll speak to the physio, but you've got to trust your players, it's usually about a conversation, and I think the conversation leans very heavily on, this is not about you, this is about the team. And you understand that if you go out in the field, and yes, it can happen, but if you're carrying that injury and you're going to risk us using up a sub in a grand final, well, that's on you. So, think carefully. It did happen this year. We had, we had a situation with our front rowers, and unfortunately, early on in the season, we lost our loose head. He snapped his Achilles, which really threw us a cat amongst the pigeons. But we had a prop who came out of Colts last year, and he really stood up to the mark. Now, in one of the semi-finals, he was indirectly given a blue card, and we actually tried to fight it. And you have to go through Rugby Australia. In the end, they said no, he's out. The other prop that we had been out for 3 weeks with a shoulder complaint, and he'd been resting it, doing his rehabilitation. So not only did I lose the extra prop, I had a prop who was going into this game with a shoulder complaint. Mind you, he had an absolute blinder, and it didn't impact him. But I think the rest, and we did have that conversation about it, being on his shoulders. But he said, "I'll be right. I'll play through the pain."
Mm-hmm. All right, great. So you've worked with a lot of coaches with a variation of skill levels from diverse backgrounds who are generally all there on a voluntary basis. What do you look for in a coach at that community level?
Yeah, I often question what's more important, whether it's the coaching roster or the playing roster. And I think I might answer this in a few parts. I alluded to this before, but actually finding volunteers at this level is really, really tough. And I think at community or grassroots level, volunteerism is definitely in a slump. And anecdotally, I think COVID has really demonstrated to the whole world that there are things outside of sport, and a lot of people got used to not having to commit regularly to sport. And whether or not that's people being selfish or not, I think it's I think people are being far more prudent with their time allocation. And I guess it depends on whether you're a rusted on rugby person or not. So I think that's the first thing that I'd like to address. The second thing is it always becomes a lot easier to attract better coaches and better players when your club is experiencing success or significant growth. And I think, if the board or your committee or whoever you have is smart and strategic, they understand that, when a person makes a commitment, that it actually has to be an experience as well. So it can't be an arduous task to come along. And I think finding the right people obviously is the key. It sounds obvious, but, despite the shortage, what you can't do is just throw someone into the role, and that's what we get forced to do. This season was a classic example. We had a lot of people pulling out. We had our second grade coach who withdrew himself due to work commitments, and my first grade assistant coach and I had to coach second grade as well. So we had to coach it as a little bit of a squad, which worked out in the end, but it's still pretty hard. And I think when it comes to coaches, it's a bit of a licorice all sorts, because, some coaches will come with accreditation. Some will have lapse accreditation. Some would have played the game at a really high level. Some barely played the game at all. Some have got junior coaching experience. But that person that you can get really can impact what you can do across the club, because it really changes how you can roll your program out. So if you've got a coach who, mightn't understand the nuances of, let's say, breakdown or collision management, it gets very hard to leave someone there to coach it the way that you want, even though you might have explained it. So I think you've also got to understand that people coach for a variety of reasons. And I think that's finding out their why is probably one of the big things for me. And again, if I had my time again, I probably would have spent a little bit more time, but a condensed season, it's pretty rushed at community level. A lot of decisions aren't made, really far out. So I think you've got those people who coach because they want to get themselves out of the house and keep themselves busy and away from the kids. You've got some people who really want to learn the technical, the tactical, the emotional and managerial aspects of the game, which is great. They're obviously the ideal coaches that you want. You've got some coaches who are really ego-driven, and some genuinely want to pass on their knowledge to the next generation, and have a real desire to want to give back. But I guess if I had a checklist that I was to use, I'd probably say that number one, honesty. So they need to be an honest person. So it's about what they want out of coaching and why they're coaching, and, be honest about their commitment level. I know things can change, but it makes it hard with the planning. Adaptability is probably something that's really important. Can they cope with changing circumstances? Because it can get really frustrating when you've got something planned out, or someone, you've given someone the responsibility to do something, and then all of a sudden it's raining. And that happened a lot this year. So we had to change what we did. Third thing is probably having a growth mindset. So really willing to learn, and nothing's too difficult, because I think that fixed mindset where, this is the way that I did it and this is the way that I've always done it, really hinders the development of players and also, coaches. Because I'm not saying even as a head coach, I can't learn, because I still want to learn. And, there are plenty of coaches who might have less years of experience, but who see things differently. And I'm all happy to, learn from them. Probably the fourth thing is, like with anything in rugby, being a team player. And the final thing is being a good bloke, I think, or being a good person. No hidden agendas. We both know that there's a lot of people out there who enjoy white Andy, so we want to do that. And I think the thing that really pulls it all together is finding the best combination of people. So it's all about the skill levels and personalities that complement one another. And I think I'd really like to implore that any of the people out there, it doesn't matter whether it's at premiership level or whether it's at community level, that they're not simply going to ex-players, to run a program straight after they're finished playing, because I think everyone needs to have some kind of experience coaching in lower grades first.
Now, you talked about volunteers, sort of a dearth of volunteers at the moment, and I think that's across most sports. What can clubs do to try and improve the amount of volunteers that want to give up their time to coach, or even just to be involved?
Yeah, I think it comes down to providing the game day experience. So it's not just about for the players or for the supporters, but it needs to be about everything. So I think it's even the way you treat people. You want to make sure that the club itself is a happy environment to be at. You don't want, too many people being charged with doing too many jobs. So I think in our review this year, that's one of the things that Newport's looked at, is trying to find more people to do less, and to make the game day experience a lot more enjoyable. So if your job is to come and set the field up, you're probably not expected to pack it down, but you're a person that likes getting up, you like being out there setting up the field. Then once that's done, you can go and enjoy watching the game, or you might have another role. If you're a manager, you're managing one team, you're not having to manage multiple teams. So again, you can enjoy rugby up until your team's ready to go on. Once your team's playing, you're on. Then, depending on what grade you're coaching, once it's done, then you can enjoy the experience. And I think that's a big thing about a lot of community clubs. We had some fantastic rounds this year, both at home, but I'll make special mention of one of our rival clubs, Linfield, who did a spectacular job on their Ladies' Day. We had supporters buses go out there, and it's not very far away, but it was about making sure that their experience was great, because when they come to us, the experience is always equally as supportive.
So one of the challenges for coaches in the community level is managing the mid-season lull when it starts to get cold and the excitement around the start of the season has started to pass. How do you run and manage training at these times throughout the season?
Yeah, I think it can get incredibly tough and frustrating at grassroots level, and no doubt some clubs are better at it than others. I think from my point of view, mixing up the sessions and a lot of variety tends to scratch that itch. We this year looked at, and a lot of it was forced, but using different things like CrossFit or boxing for conditioning, getting in experts, so be it judo or wrestling experts to come in, and focusing on micro skills or facets of the game that a certain position might focus on. So some days you might have a lot of unit focus, some days you might have a lot of team focus, and other days you'll allow position specific focuses to happen. And I think you kind of have to be pretty creative and always have a plan B in your back pocket. And I think sometimes, even an early finish. So I'm often heard saying, short, sharp and accurate. So if we can get it done by this time, we can get out. And a lot of the guys really buy into that, and that they're pushing each other. So, their standards, are high, and they want to get out. Because, up on the Northern Beaches, the boys love their rugby union, but they also love their rugby league. And, when the Sea Eagles are playing, they love to get home and watch it, or get down to the pub and watch it. But I think the other thing too is being creative in what you do. And I think gamification is something that I also try and bring in. That's probably more so in pre-season. So I think it's important to be able to look at taking a skill and being able to shift that from a closed skill into something where it's applying those skills in multiple ways.
So, Greg, a common frustration I hear from coaches at the community level, when it comes to development courses, we often get provided with examples from professional coaches who have full squads. But in reality, at the community level, there are times when you haven't got a full team, and you might have planned something, but a key player doesn't turn up because of either work or family commitments. So what do you do in these scenarios when you've planned for a full team, but you might only have, 3/4 of the team turn up?
Yeah, I think missing players at training is a reality, and you really have to be creative and always have an alternative plan up your sleeve. Wherever possible, I always have a plan B. The courses that we go to rarely deliver what's based on reality. A lot of it is based on the professional environment as well. So they don't really address these things. So it's been a long, arduous task, and learning through mistakes and trying to think more creatively. So the way that I do it is I always over-plan a session and divide it into the must-dos. So at my non-negotiables, then the should-dos and the could-dos. But what I do is I keep the should-dos and could-dos up my sleeve, and they're not part of the session plan that I might give to the other coaches. And an example of that in practical terms, say, for example, I'm missing my hooker, and I plan to do some 8-on-8 scrummaging, or some full line-out attacking moves or things like that. What I can do is change it up and say, all right, well, if I can't do that, what I can work on is I can work on my defensive line-out lifts. I can work on my speed across the ground. I can work on countering a driving maul. In scrummaging, I can do 2v1 or 3v2 body shape work and still work on sink and squeeze, but in smaller groups. I might do, control at the back for number 8. So it's taking what we were going to do and just trying to, focus more on the micro skills involved. Likewise, if it was a 9 or 10, obviously it's pretty hard to work on any moves that you're going to do. But what I do is I might work on what happens if my 9 and 10 gets caught in a ruck. Or it might be, how do we fill our roles defensively if our nine's in or our 10's in? Again, micro skills, we might work on those catch pass skills that, it's never too often that you can do those. Might be talking about how the back 3 connect better or wide ruck defense. So, I think the examples are endless, but you've just got to make sure you're planning for those and know exactly what you're going to achieve and want to achieve if plan A doesn't work.
You've given some good examples of what you can do if players are away. So often as coaches, we can be deflated because missing key players can throw our whole session into disarray. But essentially what you're doing is using the players available to provide some typical scenarios, for example, when your halfback or your 10's out of action, or alternatively, maybe what happens if you've got 1 or 2 players off the field due to red or yellow cards. So you've essentially identified how important it is for coaches to adjust on the run.
Yeah, no, I think you're right, but that's probably the best example. Personally, I have a rule at training that if you're missing a player, that you carry your own dead. So you don't just go and take the guy from down below, and that's just my personal view because all you're doing is shifting the problem. But we use things like that where the backs are missing a winger or the backs are missing a 10, so they just have to work harder because, like you said, it could be a yellow card. What do we need to do? And then it becomes a session where we're talking to players and it's more about inquiry learning. So what would we do if this scenario was presented to us? So we have a discussion, let's give it a crack, let's have it, and then we'll break and we'll talk about it again.
So you're essentially adapting on the run and turning what could potentially be perceived as a negative situation and turn it into a positive learning opportunity.
Yeah, and don't think that I feel deflated too. So I don't think you're alone there. I just try not to show it, and I try and make it feel like I had this planned all the way along. So it seems pretty seamless to the players, and I think that's also important, as far as coaching is concerned, because the players do feed a lot off the coaches, and I think positivity is important, but being realistic is important as well.
Greg, you mentioned earlier on former players becoming coaches. Is it better to have former players become coaches as they know the game so well?
Look, absolutely. I'd be surprised if any coach hasn't played the game at some level, during their life. But obviously the level that they've played at varies. And I don't always believe that you had to have played at that level to coach at that level. So, there seems to be an emerging pattern of retiring players being parachuted straight into higher grade coaching positions without, really having experienced any kind of coaching. My question actually is, how much value are they adding at that point in time? Don't get me wrong. I think that there are some specialist coaches that may be suitable, but I've seen a lot of responsibility placed on new coaches' shoulders, and some of them actually, don't perform that well. And I think that, the transference or the dissemination of information and, the preparation of a periodized program isn't as simple as it seems. And the higher the level, the more complex it can be. So I think it's important getting someone who can provide that guidance, who may have been doing it for a while, and those coaches can certainly learn. But as we both know, you can go to uni for 4 years and learn how to organise programs and disseminate information, and you end up with a teacher's degree. So I think it's really important that it's not just flippantly approached when we apply it to rugby, especially when you're getting paid for it now, because I think the pedagogy or the science behind teaching is pretty similar, and if not the same as coaching. But I'd be very, very surprised whether many coaches, if they weren't teachers, could tell you if they're using a constructive approach or a collaborative or integrative approach when they're actually coaching, or whether they are, I mentioned before, inquiry-based learning, Would it be effective? How much are they reflecting on their session? So those things that I guess, we've learned over time, and both being teachers, we can apply directly to coaching. And I think we're missing out a lot, and I think it's probably we're missing a lot of the coaching acumen that we could be instilling into a lot of players and a lot of other coaches, because of the education system we have in coaching. And also I think the I don't know, dare I say it, the closed shop mentality of coaching appointments. So it's pretty hard to move up the food chain.
Greg, you just spoke about coaching acumen. In a lot of sports, higher honours coaching certification tends to target high-performance coaches. Often there's a requirement to hold a certain level of certification. However, to be invited into certain certification programs, you're required to be coaching at a certain level as well. It's a bit like the chicken and the egg debate. What are your thoughts on coach development and progression?
My first response is with another question. What do we have in place to identify emerging coaches or good coaches in general? What about what makes coaches better themselves if they want to go out and do courses? What's open to them? The courses, I think, in my opinion, are probably poorly targeted, and genuine coaches are missing out on educational opportunities. I think the coaching pyramid's upside down. We don't want the smallest number of our well-qualified coaches to be right up the top. We actually want the best educated coaches coaching our kids, and that's where we have the least qualified coaches. So we often hear the complaints about poor skill sets, or the kids coming out of rugby nurseries who only understand patterns, and those patterns have been ingrained so deeply that their skills are hard to vary. So when it comes to playing heads-up rugby, they find it really, really difficult. And I think part of that is our coaching education system, and probably the other half is our obsession with winning. So I think I see it at the junior level and senior level all the time, where teams are running through their phase play or their patterns, and some players can't even pass properly or accurately, should I say, from left to right, or players are running a move and it's all happening laterally, but then what you see is they're doing it unopposed, but the coach is slapping them on the back saying, well done. Yeah, you can see all the flaws. Now, is that taught in some of the courses? Because I think, they're the kind of things that we need to address. I think New Zealand probably have a slightly different system where their sharing and their education of, I guess, what you would consider lower ranked coaches, so the ones who are doing their junior stuff, is really heavily encouraged. So again, I think it comes down to the experience. And I think if you want to move up in the ranks, how do you do it at the moment? If you're coaching at premiership level and want to improve and do a level 3, you can't do it unless you're invited to do the application and it's approved. So I think the difficulty is you're unlikely to be approved unless you're coaching at that higher level. So like you said, chicken and egg situation. If you're not a high school teacher, you're unlikely to get an opportunity to coach at high level, CHS or New South Wales level. If you're not part of the in crowd, you're very unlikely to get a junior rep job. All those things, make it pretty difficult to progress. And, the funny thing is, even though you're not guaranteed a place, ironically, if you are accepted, you still have to pay $700 to do a level 3 course. And, my question is, if you're paying anyway, why wouldn't they open it up to coaches to better themselves and to expand the knowledge base, which is only going to benefit the game? I think, without sounding too cynical, there's a lot of people in the same place making the same decisions and, making the same appointments. And I wouldn't be the only one to say that a lot of decisions are pretty political, I think. I mean, maybe I'm going out on a limb here, but, if I were in charge, I think the way I'd do it is I'd have some core units that all coaches must satisfy. So, for example, you might have everyone has to do the laws of the game. Everyone has to understand and pass safety protocols, and maybe the basis of attack and defense with some, I think, fundamental or rudimentary biomechanical stuff. Then once you've satisfied that, it should be tailored to suit. So, for example, a junior coach is going to need something completely different to a senior men's coach. So if you're coaching under 14s, you're not teaching crutch binding, you're not teaching leg lifting. So their requirements are really, really different. And then you could probably break it down even further, and you could look for specialisation. So if you wanted to be a specialist backs or a forwards coach, or if you wanted to focus on attack or defence, that you could actually do that. If you wanted to do all of it, you could do that as well. Because I think, again, as a head coach, you've got to have an overall understanding of, for example, I know with us, I might be more of a forwards expert and you might be more of a backs expert, but we still have to both know each other's roles and understand what we're talking about and the nuances involved. So I guess, the strange thing is you can't drive a truck or a bus with a car or motorbike license, right? And at the moment, with the accreditation, you can coach pretty much anything. So if you're a junior coach and your son's in the under 16s and you've done your level 1 and maybe you've even done your level 2, but you've always been a back, and you're asked to coach line-out lifting and scrums, obviously you might be able to do it, but is that where your expertise are? And does the course adequately give you the information that you need to do it? And it's the same with scrummaging.
So for a coach who is looking to move up or develop in their accreditation, what are the opportunities for them to learn or to progress more if they're not getting accepted into higher opportunities?
Well, I think it becomes really tough. Yes, you can get some experience off other coaches. I mean, I know that when I was coaching at Warringah under Darren Coleman, the current Waratahs coach, I'd been coaching for 16 years and I didn't go in with a closed mindset. I wanted to learn. And I certainly learned a heck of a lot off DC and the way that he handled things, his attacking shapes, his patterns, all those types of things. So that's where I learnt most of my trade. But I wanted to further my coaching education, but you're just limited. I remember years ago, they used to hold advanced coaching seminars, which they don't do a lot of these days. And a lot of them, they had specialists in there. But again, I can't stress enough that it's very hard, depending on the level that you're coaching at, even if you're at Shoot Shield level, if they're talking and giving examples of what's happening at elite level, like with the Wallabies or even, the Waratahs or Brumbies, how does it translate back into the game? Not every coach is able to take that information, water it down and apply it, because quite often you see people will look at moves or they'll look at patterns of play or things that look fantastic on TV, because Wallabies are training, 6 hours a day on it, and you're trying to implement it at a junior club. And that's where I think the disconnect is.
So we've really got to try and differentiate almost our coaching programs to meet the needs of our community level coaches, our juniors, and then our more high performance environment.
Absolutely. And I think the differentiation is probably the key. And I know that sometimes, it takes money, it takes time, it takes people. I get that. I understand it. But how else are we going to develop those things? Now, one of the things that the part of my role at Warringah was not only, being the head coach, but also coaching director. And at the moment, I'm still going through it, but working with one of the people in the junior club to try and facilitate some learning for some of the coaches in the lower age groups who it might be a dad. So we're looking at putting videos together or getting information from New South Wales Rugby. So there's a hub that already exists, but we're trying to make it easy for them to actually have a program there so they can actually roll it out. And if they're busy at work, but they're coming to coach, that they don't have to sit there and do the lesson planning for the session. And we're hoping that we can do a lot of that for them so they can print it off, they can come to training and they can just do it. The other things we're looking at doing at our club level is, coaching the coach. But again, it's something that how are you helping coaches who take on that role, who are experienced but haven't got the accreditation to do it?
From your point of view, being not just your head coach of Newport, but you're also, I understand, the coaching director. So you've got some input into what the juniors are doing. Am I correct in saying that? In
some aspects, not across individual teams, but what I've offered is my services if a coach gets stuck or there's a problem that needs sorted out, that I can go down and help that team. So, for example, I've helped the under 15s team do specific things. I've helped our women's team do specific things. So it's more about on an at-need basis. But I think rolling that whole program out, so the board all agreed with it. It was probably a funny season because we had a lot of wet weather. So the juniors cancel a lot easier than the seniors. So I think depending on what I do next year, hopefully we can sort of extrapolate that into something where it becomes practical information for the coaches.
Just going back to that, is there a lot of interest from coaches to learn more from those junior coaches, or are they satisfied with what they know and happy to just sort of keep going along on that level?
Oh, I think time's the factor. So I think we wanted to try and test the water and see whether or not if we held some kind of coaches day or players academy or something along those lines, how much interest it would actually generate. Because I think until you know what they want, so we're thinking about surveys. We're thinking about doing a couple of different things and being proactive in that space. Because yes, I'm not saying New South Wales don't offer things, but I don't think they're as proactive as what we'd all like them to be. So we're going to try and do it at club level in the first instance.
Yeah, okay. I'm just going to go back to the question around the former players.
Yeah.
We talked about how you mentioned that obviously their knowledge in the game is or can be really helpful in a coaching program, but obviously they're lacking some of the pedagogical requirements.
Yeah.
How can those players or the former players who are now coaching, how can they develop those or understand some of those pedagogical requirements that they might take for granted? Because, I was coached by this player for, 15 years or 10 years or whatever it might be. And now I'm coaching. I'm just going to take, exactly what I've been exposed to at the professional environment and now put into, the school environment or the community club environment or the shoot shield environment. How do we educate those guys so that they can better understand, what they did at that professional environment might not necessarily work, and they might require certain other pedagogies to implement at the other environments?
I think that for a former player, and we certainly don't want to lose their rugby IQ. So maybe some sort of bridging course would be really good. So they've got a lot of the knowledge, but it's we're talking about the example that you provided was almost a round peg in a square hole. Where I'll try and make this fit because this is what I know. Whereas understanding that pedagogy, that could be delivered in a bridging course to say, okay, so you've got this information. How can you disseminate that at the level that you're playing at now? So I think it's if a player, say for example, is a former shoot shield player and they go straight into shoot shield coaching, I think they'd be able to do a lot of the on-field things where we're talking about skill development or we're talking about maybe some game nous. But when we're talking about rolling out a program, so if they're parachuted straight into a head coaching role, as we both know, setting up a whole program is not as easy as it looks, because this is about pre-planning, it's about periodization, it's about recruitment, it's about retention, it's about making sure that all the volunteers and anyone who's paid is looked after properly. It's the communication to the players, it's communication to the board. All those types of things don't just happen, and it takes time to learn it. So I think being assigned to a mentor coach, I think one of the big things that that a lot of head coaches may not consider, and maybe they don't have to, but the heart and soul of a lot of these clubs are based on the lower grade players, because a lot of these lower grade players are the guys or girls who become presidents or become club secretaries or general managers or run the canteen or cook the barbecue. All those types of things need to be understood. And I think also what's made me a better coach, in my opinion, is coaching a lower grade and knowing that you might have to be making phone calls at 11 o'clock at night to put a team together because the club's having a bad run, or you're heading down to the pub to see if you can pull someone out to fill a position. Now, whilst it sounds humorous, the truth is that it actually happens. So appreciating what needs to happen at that level also gives you appreciation of players backing up, players wanting to back up. What's the experience that they have? Because a lot of coaches, I think, are very blinkered when they look at things, and they're only worried about their specific team. It's sort of like, I guess, training as a squad. is second grade merely cannon fodder for first grade, or are you actually trying to develop the next breed of players? I know in a perfect world, you want those players to be able to replace them, but it's very different at premiership level than at community level, because I know that at my club, there's a massive gap between some skill sets, but it's my job to try and close it as best possible and to come up with alternatives.
That's a great answer. Look, I heard an interview with Wayne Pearce many years ago, and it was not long after Wayne Pearce, the former Balmain Tigers captain and legend, retired from playing. He got parachuted, I think, into the State of Origin coaching role, and from memory, wasn't very successful. And the interview was looking at his experience as a coach, and he said, "You know what? The problem was I didn't learn how to be a coach beforehand. I went into that role thinking as I did as a player and expecting everybody else to have the same attitude towards preparation, the same attitude towards training, the same attitude or abilities in terms of their on-field abilities as I had as a player." And it frustrated me, or frustrated Wayne as a coach. And I think that sort of goes exactly back to what you were talking about, developing an understanding of the needs of the group and the requirements of the group moving forward. And obviously, as an athlete, he has all these abilities, but he now needs to learn how to, or back then, he then needed to apply his abilities in the right setting for the right, the introverted players, the extroverted players, the players that are open to harsh feedback, the players that might be, prefer feedback privately. So it's just about developing some of those other skills of coaching as well.
No, I think we read the same book.
Yeah.
No, you're exactly right. And I think those nuances are the hardest things to pick up, but probably some of the most important parts. I mean, getting to know your players. We didn't touch on this, but one of those key things to getting to know your players is understanding their soft skills. So we know that with hard skills, we can teach a person to catch and pass, but I want to know what they do outside of work. I want to know whether they've got kids. I want to know whether they're in a managerial position, because those soft skills can also help you on the field and with your team management. So I think that's all part of the learning. Now, we talk about a lot of teachers become coaches, and a lot of those coaches are quite successful. If you look at people like Graham Henry, if you look at Eddie Jones, both former teachers, both former principals or headmasters, they understand the pedagogical approach. And also, I think it's important to emphasize the fact that a lot of the Rugby World Cup winning coaches never played for their country. I mean, when you look at Australia, our two coaches who won Rugby World Cups, Rod McQueen and Bob Dwyer, both of those guys never played for the Wallabies, yet were able to do this. Michael Checker never played for the Wallabies, but won a Super Rugby title, took the Wallabies pretty close. And it goes without saying, there's a lot of other examples. So I think we've got to be really, really careful about simply appointing someone because they're an ex-player. I think we're missing the boat, and we're letting a lot of people fall through the strainer that are out there that can offer a lot to rugby.
One of the things you mentioned before was the board. Now, in professional environment, we often hear a lot about the relationship between the coach and the board, and sometimes we hear about this toxicity that is involved with the coaching staff or the playing crew and the board. Is the relationship of the coach and the board at the community level important?
100%. I guess the biggest thing that I've learned is the importance of alignment. Alignment at every level. We're talking about with the board, coaches with the players, making sure that everyone is on the same page and paddling in the same direction. And I think, unfortunately, I've had experiences where, parts of management are working against the coach or the coaching group. And, if you're getting sabotaged by someone for just trying to do your job, it's making it all that more difficult. Now, obviously, depending on the level that you're involved at, sometimes money's involved. Sometimes it's people's jobs that are at stake. So it does matter, but it does happen at community level as well. One of the greatest relationship I've had with, I guess, a president of a club was this year. Now, our alignment was there right from the beginning. We were off the same hymn sheet. We were aligned all the way through. And I think that translated into some success that we had, because he understood where I was coming from. I understood where he was coming from. And we were able to be really honest with our communications. But knowing where we were and being honest about it was probably the key. Not, well, we'd like you to do as well as possible. Well, what does that look like? What are you expecting? And this is what I can, this is what I can deliver based on what we have. So we both understood that this was what we wanted to achieve, and this is how we're going to do it.
What does poor alignment look like?
Look, I think when you're not being honest, we talk about success. Again, it's pretty subjective. So I mentioned previously, you could go in there as a coach and you look at the player roster you've got and you think, I don't think we're going to win a comp. And I think you've got to be honest enough with that. Now, whether the board wants to hear that or the committee wants to hear that's another thing. But, in my experience, unless you're a professional coach and unless they've got deep pockets, it makes it pretty difficult. So I think being honest in that situation. Now, if you say to the board, what are you expecting of me? And they say, well, we'd like to see some growth. We'd like to see you develop our players. And, we'd like to see a couple more wins. Right. Well, is that 1 win? Is that 2 wins? Is that 3 wins? Because if it's the win-loss ratio that you're looking for, your approach is going to be very different. But that's not building for success. That's building from year to year, because it's very, very simple. I mean, there's a couple of clubs out there who have risen through the ranks. And has it been from development, or has it been from deep pockets and buying the right players? So I think transparency is really important, and that misalignment. So if the club wants you to do X and you're delivering Y, it's never going to work, because you're always going to be chasing your tail.
So just in terms of the alignment, it doesn't necessarily have to be the case that if the coach wants this, the board always agrees, or if the board wants this, the coach always agrees. It's about being honest, and sometimes you might have disagreements, and the coach might ask for something but not get it, but maintain that good relationship, and you can still move forward together. Is that?
Yeah, I think you're spot on with that. But I think right from the outset, that question needs to be asked: what's the end goal? I mean, no one goes into the competition without not wanting to win the comp, but sometimes, as we both know, it's going to be physically impossible because you don't have the cattle. So I think the board need to understand that. As a coach nowadays myself, I probably wouldn't take a job on if the board or the committee said, our job or your job this year is to win the comp. If I didn't believe that I at least had the cattle, or I had a budget to be able to recruit, or I had the means to be able to recruit, I wouldn't take the job, because you're setting yourself up for failure. I know it's completely different if you're, if you're getting paid for the job, but, respectfully, I look at some of the clubs out there. Let's talk about the next echelon up. So if we talk about Premiership rugby, there are some clubs that finished, let's say, the last 3 or 4 clubs on the competition table. What's their board expecting? What are they promising as coaches? Is it about development? Is it a 3-year plan? And if it is a 3-year plan, are they being genuine about it? Because ultimately, I think it becomes very easy for a board to measure success by wins, and everyone wants to be associated with this success. It's easier to attract a crowd. You get more people at the ground. It means more revenue. It means that sponsors are happier, so you can, renew those sponsorships. So I think it's a really important area to understand it. So that it comes back also to that game day experience. You can still be losing, and I think grassroots clubs do it the best. There's plenty of clubs out there who aren't being successful but can still have a good time, because it becomes about the rugby. We were pretty successful this year, but we dished it out to a few teams who were struggling, but they still came back to the clubhouse. They still had drinks. We still had a boat race. We still were chatting to guys. They were talking about the difficulties that we're having, and it's about being part of a rugby community. And I think grassroots level probably do it the best, and I think the alignment probably happens more often and more accurately at that level, but that's because players aren't looking for contracts into Super Rugby. Coaches aren't looking to take the next step and maintain their professional, I guess, level of coaching. So,
Greg, you've had a really successful season in subbies this year with the Newport Breakers. What's next for Greg Lee? Are you going around for another year, or are you looking at coaching back in the premiership in the future?
Do I have to be honest?
Yep.
Look, I the funny thing is, I was actually going to take a year off this year, but the sales pitch from the president was just too enticing. And luckily for me, it was a successful year. So, look, ideally, yes, I'd like to get back into coaching at premiership level, but securing the right appointment is important, and it's pretty tough at the moment. So, I think Newport, what they're doing is looking to move up into the top division next year if the union actually allows it. And if that happens, it'll be a pretty decent challenge. I mean, Division 1 boasts a lot of former Shoot Shield players. It has a lot of guys who could probably be playing higher, but just don't have the time because their career or their family life comes first, but they still enjoy their rugby. So watch this space.
Well, Greg Lee, thanks so much for joining me on the Coach Doctor podcast. It's been really enjoyable having a chat.
James, an absolute pleasure.
Thanks for listening to this episode of the Coach Doctor podcast. As you can hear, Greg is extremely insightful and passionate about coaching at the community level. As he identifies, there are so many benefits and positives to coaching at this level. However, there are also often regular challenges that coaches within the community level have to deal with. Player availability and management is at the forefront of Greg's list. Managing player workloads along with daily work requirements is a big one. As coaches, we can easily overtrain players who have been working on building sites all day, expecting the same from them as we do from the players who are relatively well rested working in a desk job. It's time to understand this and realise that not all athletes require the same loading. Greg also discusses the opportunities to develop and learn as a community coach. Unfortunately, there are little pathways for community coaches to develop, and like Greg identifies, often courses are aimed at elite environments and might miss the core participants in the game. Finally, Greg discusses the importance of volunteerism and how clubs need to ensure they make volunteers welcome and make the experience enjoyable. Being involved in community sport is a social opportunity which meets one of our basic human needs, so making sure volunteers enjoy this aspect is vital. If you've enjoyed this episode, please like it and share it amongst your contacts and fellow coaches. If you're a community coach, I hope we've answered some of your questions, and until next time, keep learning.